The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. 23 years of service had taught him that perfection in appearance was just as important as the weapon at his side. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony that would begin in less than an hour. James had seen it all during his career with the Queen's Guard. Drunk tourists trying to make the guards laugh, children attempting to climb the palace gates, and countless marriage proposals staged in front of the iconic red-coated sentries. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what would unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in June. The crowd was typical for a summer day. Families with excited children pressed against the black iron railings, their faces filled with wonder at the spectacle before them. Street performers entertained the waiting masses while vendors sold miniature Union Jack flags and toy soldiers. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and joy, the kind of innocent excitement that made James remember why he loved his duty of protecting not just the royal family, but also the hundreds of visitors who came to witness British tradition. Among the crowd, 8-year-old Emma Thompson clutched her mother's hand tightly. This was her first visit to London, a special birthday treat from her parents who had saved for months to make this trip possible. Emma's eyes sparkled with delight as she watched the guards in their magnificent uniforms, their tall bearskin hats making them appear like characters from a fairy tale. Her mother, Sarah, smiled down at her daughter's wonder, remembering her own first visit to the palace decades earlier. Standing just 3 people behind the Thompson family was Marcus Webb, a man whose appearance would have raised no alarms among the casual observers. Dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, he blended seamlessly into the crowd. But beneath his unremarkable exterior, something dark was brewing. Marcus had been planning this day for weeks, driven by grievances that made sense only in his troubled mind. His fingers kept touching the object concealed in his jacket pocket, a 6-inch hunting knife that he had purchased specifically for this purpose. The morning had started like any other for James. His alarm had sounded at 5:30, followed by his usual routine of physical exercise, breakfast, and the meticulous process of preparing his uniform. Each button polished to a mirror shine, every piece of equipment checked and rechecked. The red tunic, the bearskin hat, the rifle that would remain unloaded but whose presence served as both symbol and deterrent. As he took his position at the palace gates, James's trained eyes began their automatic scan of the crowd. Years of experience had taught him to look beyond the obvious, to notice the subtle signs that might indicate trouble. A person standing too close to the barriers, someone whose behavior seemed inconsistent with the joyful atmosphere, hands that moved nervously to concealed objects. It was a skill that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training, a sixth sense that had kept him and others safe throughout his career. The changing of the guard ceremony was more than just a tourist attraction. It represented centuries of tradition, a living symbol of duty, honor, and service. Each movement was choreographed with military precision, every step measured and deliberate. The guards who participated weren't just performers in elaborate costumes. They were highly trained soldiers capable of switching from ceremonial duties to active protection in an instant. Emma Thompson had positioned herself at the perfect spot along the railing, her small hands gripping the black iron bars as she pressed, her face between them for the best possible view. Her parents stood protectively behind her, occasionally lifting their phones to capture photos of their daughter's joy. They had no idea that just a few feet away, Marcus Webb was growing increasingly agitated, his mental state deteriorating as the crowd pressed closer around him. The first sign of trouble came not from any dramatic gesture, but from James's peripheral vision catching an unusual movement in the crowd. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the man in the dark jacket had triggered his internal alarm system. Without moving his head or changing his stoic expression, James began to focus more intently on the section of crowd where Marcus stood. What James couldn't know was that Marcus had been struggling with severe mental health issues for months, issues that had gone largely untreated due to his isolation and distrust of authority figures. In his distorted reality, the royal family represented everything he believed was wrong with society. The ceremony before him, wasn't a celebration of tradition, but a symbol of oppression that needed to be disrupted. The knife in his pocket felt heavy with purpose, and his original plan to simply brandish it and make a scene was evolving into something far more dangerous. As the ceremony began, and the crowd's attention focused on the marching guards, Marcus found himself fixated on the small girl pressed against the railing in front of him. In his troubled mind, she represented innocence corrupted by the system he despised. The knife seemed to pulse in his pocket as his grip tightened around its handle. The moment that would change everything was approaching, though none of the hundreds of people present could have predicted what was about to unfold. James continued his vigilant watch, his training and instincts working together to prepare him for a threat he hadn't yet fully identified. Emma Thompson continued to watch in wonder, completely unaware of the danger building behind her. And Marcus Webb took his first step toward an action that would test the true meaning of duty, courage, and the split-second decisions that define heroes. The stage was set for an encounter that would demonstrate the difference between wearing a uniform and truly embodying the values it represents. The first notes of the military band echoed across the courtyard as the ceremony officially began. James felt the familiar surge of pride that accompanied these moments, when centuries of tradition came alive through the synchronized movements of his fellow guards. But today, that feeling was tempered by a growing sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. Marcus Webb's breathing had become shallow and rapid. The press of the crowd around him felt suffocating, and the cheerful chatter of the tourists seemed to mock his inner turmoil. His hand moved to the knife in his pocket for the third time in as many minutes, fingers tracing the outline of the weapon through the fabric. The plan that had seemed so clear in the privacy of his small apartment now felt chaotic and urgent. Emma Thompson bounced on her toes, trying to see over the heads of the adults in front of her. Her father noticed her, struggled, and lifted her onto his shoulders, giving her an unobstructed view of the magnificent spectacle. From her new vantage point, Emma could see everything with crystal clarity. The guards in their pristine uniforms, the tourists with their cameras, and somewhere in her peripheral vision, the man in the dark jacket whose face seemed different from all the smiling faces around her. Sarah Thompson felt a mother's instinctive concern as she noticed her daughter's expression change slightly. Emma had always been perceptive, often picking up on things that adults missed. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, but Emma just shook her head, unable to articulate the feeling that something wasn't quite right. James had identified his target. Years of training had taught him to trust his gut instincts, and every alarm bell in his mind was now ringing about the man in the dark jacket. The way Marcus held himself, the nervous energy radiating from his position, the repetitive movement of his hand to his pocket, all of these details painted a picture that James recognized from his extensive security training. The challenge facing James was one that every guard understood but hoped never to encounter. He was bound by strict protocols about maintaining his ceremonial position during the changing of the guard. Moving without clear and immediate justification could result in disciplinary action and potentially end his career. But staying motionless, while a potential threat developed, could result in something far worse than professional consequences. Marcus's internal dialogue had devolved into a stream of anger and justification. The little girl on her father's shoulders represented everything pure that he believed was being corrupted by the system. In his distorted thinking, striking out at innocence would send the message that nowhere was safe from his anger. The knife felt warm in his palm as he slowly began to withdraw it from his pocket. The crowd around Marcus was completely absorbed in the ceremony. Phones were raised to capture videos, children pointed excitedly at the marching guards, and couples posed for photos with the palace in the background. Nobody noticed the subtle but significant change in the atmosphere that James was detecting from his position 30 feet away. Emma Thompson felt it first. Children often do. The sudden shift in energy from the man standing behind her family made her skin prickle with an instinctive fear she couldn't understand. She turned slightly on her father's shoulders and looked directly at Marcus, their eyes meeting for just a moment. What she saw there made her small hands grip her father's hair tightly. "Daddy," Emma whispered, but her voice was lost in the sound of the military band and the excited chatter of the crowd. Her father was focused on taking photos and didn't register her quiet concern. Sarah Thompson was adjusting her purse strap and missed her daughter's attempt to communicate something important. James saw the moment when Marcus's hand emerged from his pocket. The blade of the hunting knife caught the morning sunlight, creating a brief but unmistakable flash of steel. In that instant, James's world shifted into the heightened awareness state that his military training had drilled into him. Time seemed to slow as he processed the scene before him. The weapon now visible in Marcus's hand, the small family standing directly in front of the armed man, and the hundreds of innocent people who were about to witness something terrible. The protocols that governed James's behavior were clear about maintaining his position during ceremony. But there were other protocols, deeper ones written into his very soul during his years of service, that demanded action when innocent lives were threatened. The internal battle lasted less than a second, but in that moment James made the decision that would define not just the next few minutes, but his entire legacy as a guardian. Marcus raised the knife, his target clear in his mind. The little girl on her father's shoulders was within easy reach, and the chaos that would follow his action would send the message he wanted to deliver. His arm began its downward motion, driven by months of accumulated rage and mental illness that had found its focus in this moment of terrible clarity. But Marcus had made a critical error in his planning. He had focused so intently on the ceremonial aspects of the guard's duties that he had forgotten their primary purpose. These weren't actors in elaborate costumes performing for tourists. They were highly trained soldiers whose first and most sacred duty was the protection of innocent lives. James moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone wearing the formal, restrictive uniform of the Queen's Guard. His years of physical training, his experience in active military service, and his unwavering commitment to duty combined in a display of controlled power that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. The crowd's perception shifted from festive celebration to shocked confusion in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The perfectly choreographed ceremony continued around them, but suddenly all attention was focused on the drama unfolding at the palace railings. Phones that had been recording the changing of the guard now captured something far more significant. The moment when duty transcended protocol and heroism emerged from the most unexpected place. Emma Thompson would later tell her parents that she saw the guard moving toward them before she even understood why. Her young mind couldn't process the threat that Marcus represented, but she recognized safety when she saw it approaching in the form of James's red uniform and determined expression. The distance between James and the unfolding crisis was only 30 feet. But those 30 feet contained a sea of tourists, barriers, and protocol that should have made intervention impossible. James's movement through the crowd was like watching a masterclass in controlled urgency. He didn't run or shout, actions that would have caused panic and potentially made the situation worse. Instead, he moved with purposeful determination, his training allowing him to navigate through the crowd without creating the chaos that Marcus was seeking. Marcus's knife was now fully visible, the 6-inch blade gleaming menacingly in the morning sun. His face had transformed from the unremarkable expression he had worn while blending with the crowd to something far more sinister. The mental illness that had been building pressure in his mind for months had finally found its outlet, and the innocent child on her father's shoulders had become the focal point of his rage. Emma Thompson's father, David, was still completely unaware of the danger approaching from behind. He was adjusting his camera settings, trying to capture the perfect shot of the ceremony for the family album. His wife Sarah had moved slightly to his left to get a better angle for her own photos. Neither parent had any idea that their daughter had become the target of a man whose grip on reality had completely shattered. But Emma knew. Children possess an instinctive understanding of danger that adults often lose as they grow older. She could feel the malevolent energy radiating from Marcus, could sense the threat even though she couldn't fully comprehend it. Her small hands gripped her father's hair more tightly, and she began to whimper softly, a sound that was lost in the noise of the crowd and the military band. James had covered half the distance when Marcus raised the knife above his head. The blade was positioned directly above Emma's small form, and James realized with crystal clarity that he had perhaps 3 seconds to prevent a tragedy that would haunt hundreds of witnesses for the rest of their lives. The protocols that governed his behavior as a ceremonial guard seemed irrelevant now, overshadowed by the more fundamental duty to protect innocent life. The other guards in the ceremony had not yet noticed the drama unfolding in the crowd. Their attention was focused on their choreographed movements, their eyes fixed forward as tradition demanded. The military band continued to play, unaware that their music was providing an incongruously cheerful soundtrack to a potential tragedy. Only James, with his position facing the crowd and his trained awareness, had detected the threat in time to respond. Marcus's downward strike began, his entire body weight behind the blade as he aimed for the child who had become the symbol of everything he wanted to destroy. In his fractured mental state, this single act of violence would somehow balance the scales of what he perceived as cosmic injustice. The knife began its deadly arc toward Emma Thompson's defenseless form. James launched himself forward with all the power his years of physical training could provide. His red uniform jacket strained against his shoulders as he moved faster than should have been possible in the formal attire. The tall bearskin hat flew from his head, landing somewhere in the crowd as he abandoned all pretense of ceremonial dignity in favor of life-saving action. The collision between James and Marcus happened just as the knife reached the apex of its deadly arc. James's shoulder caught Marcus in the center of his chest with the force of a rugby tackle, driving the air from his lungs and sending him sprawling backward into the crowd. The knife flew from Marcus's grip, clattering harmlessly on the cobblestones, several feet away from its intended victim. Emma Thompson felt the change in the air around her before she understood what had happened. One moment there had been danger pressing close behind her, and the next there was safety in the form of a red-uniformed guard who had appeared like something from a fairy tale. Her young mind couldn't process all the details, but she understood that the nice soldier had made the scary feeling go away. David Thompson spun around at the sound of the commotion, his daughter still perched on his shoulders. What he saw defied immediate comprehension. A royal guard in a wrestling match with a man in a dark jacket, both of them rolling on the ground just feet from where his family stood. The knife lying nearby told a story that David's mind initially refused to accept. Sarah Thompson's maternal instincts kicked in with devastating clarity. She saw the weapon, saw her daughter's position, and understood immediately how close they had come to unspeakable tragedy. Her scream of realization cut through the noise of the crowd like a blade, causing heads to turn and the first ripples of panic to spread through the gathered tourists. James had Marcus pinned to the ground now, his years of military training evident in the efficiency of his restraint technique. Marcus struggled beneath him, but his manic strength was no match for James's professional skill and superior physical condition. The guard's face remained calm and focused even as he controlled a man who was still trying to reach the fallen knife. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning realization. Those closest to the incident had seen enough to understand that something terrible had almost happened, but the full scope of what James had prevented would only become clear later. Phones that had been recording the ceremony now captured the aftermath of heroism, though the crucial seconds of action had happened too quickly for most to follow. Marcus's mental break became complete as the reality of his failed plan penetrated his consciousness. He began to rant incoherently about injustice and corruption, his words making no sense to the horrified onlookers, but providing clear evidence of the psychological crisis that had driven him to this moment. His eyes darted continuously toward the knife that lay just out of reach, his intention to harm still burning in his fractured mind. James maintained his professional composure even as adrenaline flooded his system. He had done this before in different contexts during his military service, but never in full ceremonial dress in front of hundreds of tourists. His training had prepared him for combat situations, but not for the unique challenge of being a protector while wearing the symbolic uniform of tradition and ceremony. The aftermath of James's intervention unfolded with the precise choreography of well-trained emergency response. Within seconds of Marcus hitting the ground, other guards who had witnessed the commotion abandoned their ceremonial positions and moved to assist. The carefully orchestrated changing of the guard ceremony dissolved as duty to protect overrode adherence to protocol. Detective Inspector Helen Crawford was the first plainclothes officer to reach the scene. She had been positioned discreetly, among the crowd as part of the standard security detail for palace events, her trained eyes constantly scanning for the kind of threat that had just materialized. Her radio crackled with urgent communications as backup units were summoned, and the area began its transformation from tourist attraction to crime scene. Emma Thompson was finally lifted down from her father's shoulders, her small hands shaking as the magnitude of what had almost happened began to penetrate her young consciousness. She clung to her mother's legs, seeking comfort and security, while her eyes remained fixed on the kind guard who had made the scary man go away. In her child's understanding, he was a real-life knight who had saved her from a dragon. David Thompson stood frozen, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck as he stared at the knife lying on the cobblestones. The blade seemed impossible, too real and too deadly to belong in this place of pageantry and tradition. His mind struggled to reconcile the vacation photos he had been taking moments earlier with the weapon that had been intended for his daughter. James maintained his restraint of Marcus while speaking in calm, measured tones to the other officers now surrounding them. His military bearing remained intact despite the torn uniform jacket and the dirt on his knees from the struggle. Years of service had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came after the initial threat was neutralized, when adrenaline and confusion could lead to additional mistakes. Marcus Webb continued his incoherent rambling, his words providing a disturbing window into the mental illness that had driven him to this point. He spoke of voices that had told him to act, of messages hidden in television broadcasts, and of a grand conspiracy that only he could see. The knife had been just a tool in what his fractured mind perceived as a righteous mission. Sarah Thompson was crying now, the delayed shock hitting her as she realized how close she had come to losing her daughter. Other tourists moved away from the immediate area, some taking photos and videos while others simply stood in stunned silence. The joyful atmosphere of the morning had been replaced by something darker and more complex. The crowd's behavior revealed the full spectrum of human nature under stress. Some people immediately moved to help, asking if the family was all right and offering comfort to the obviously shaken child. Others retreated to what they perceived as safer distance, their vacation priorities suddenly reordered by witnessing real violence. Still others seemed energized by the drama, their phones capturing every moment for social media posts that would soon spread the story around the world. Detective Inspector Crawford knelt beside James and Marcus, her voice professional and calm as she took control of the situation. She had seen enough to understand that the guard's actions had prevented a tragedy, but protocol demanded that she treat the scene as an active investigation. The knife was carefully photographed and bagged as evidence, its position and condition documented for the legal proceedings that would follow. James finally released his hold on Marcus as other officers took custody of the suspect. Standing up, he brushed the dust from his uniform and retrieved his fallen bearskin hat from where it had landed in the crowd. The famous hat was slightly dented and had lost some of its pristine appearance, physical evidence of the morning's dramatic events. The transformation of the scene was remarkable to witness. What had been a celebration of tradition and pageantry was now a complex web of police tape, evidence collection, and witness interviews. The remaining tourists were asked to stay available for questioning, while crime scene photographers documented every detail of what had transpired. Emma Thompson approached James as he adjusted his uniform. Her parents tried to hold her back, but she was determined to reach the man who had saved her. When she stood before him, she didn't say anything at first, just looked up at his kind face with the serious expression that only children can master when they encounter something that changes their understanding of the world. "Thank you for keeping the bad man away," Emma finally said, her voice small but clear. The simple honesty of her words carried more weight than any official commendation could provide. James knelt down to her level, his formal military bearing softening as he addressed the child whose life he had just preserved. "That's what we're here for, little miss," James replied, his voice gentle but still carrying the authority of his position. "You were very brave, and you should be proud of yourself for staying calm." It was a brief exchange, but one that both of them would remember for the rest of their lives. David Thompson approached the guard with his wife and daughter, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming emotion that made speech difficult. How do you thank someone who has just saved your child's life? What words could possibly be adequate to express the debt that could never be repaid? The media response was swift and intense. News crews arrived within minutes of the incident, their cameras capturing the aftermath of heroism, while reporters sought interviews with anyone who had witnessed the events. The story of the royal guard who had abandoned protocol to save a child's life was exactly the kind of human interest story that would dominate headlines for days to come. James found himself at the center of attention he had never sought. As a professional soldier, he had always understood that his duty might require him to risk his life for others. But he had never imagined that moment would come while wearing the ceremonial uniform of the Queen's Guard in front of hundreds of tourists with cameras. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of Marcus Webb's mental illness and his deteriorating condition in the weeks leading up to the attack. Social workers, psychiatrists, and law enforcement officials would piece together a pattern of warning signs that had gone unrecognized by a system not equipped to handle his particular form of crisis. The weeks following the incident brought a level of attention to James Mitchell that he found both overwhelming and deeply uncomfortable. The story of the Royal Guard who had saved a child's life had captured public imagination in a way that transcended typical news cycles. Videos of the moment, captured by dozens of tourist phones, had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, each viewing reinforcing the image of heroism in action. Emma Thompson's recovery from the trauma was remarkably swift, aided by her young resilience and the loving support of her family. Child psychologists explained that her brain had processed the event as a fairy tale rescue rather than a near-death experience, a protective mechanism that would serve her well in the years to come. She drew pictures of the nice soldier for weeks afterward, her artistic interpretations showing James as a towering figure with a cape, defeating monsters with kindness rather than weapons. Marcus Webb was remanded to a secure psychiatric facility, where he would begin the long journey toward understanding and treating his mental illness. The knife attack had been the culmination of months of deteriorating psychological condition, a descent that mental health professionals would later describe as a textbook case of untreated paranoid delusions combined with severe depression. His family, who had been unaware of his crisis, struggled with guilt and questions about signs they might have missed. The Thompson family's vacation continued, but with a dramatically altered perspective. David and Sarah found themselves constantly vigilant, their trust in public spaces permanently changed by their brush with random violence. Yet they also carried with them a profound appreciation for the strangers who had protected them, the dedication of public servants who stood ready to risk everything for people they had never met. James was called to give testimony to multiple investigative bodies, each seeking to understand how the security protocols had worked and where they might be improved. His actions were unanimously praised, but the bureaucratic machinery of official review moved slowly, examining every detail of his decision to abandon his ceremonial position. Some officials questioned whether he should have waited for plainclothes security to handle the threat, while others argued that his immediate response had been the only thing that prevented tragedy. The media attention brought both benefits and challenges. James received thousands of letters and emails from people around the world, thanking him for his service and his courage. Children sent him drawings similar to Emma's, showing him as a superhero in a red coat. Veterans reached out to share their own stories of moments when duty had demanded extraordinary action. But the constant interviews and photo opportunities were exhausting for a man who had joined the military to serve, not to be celebrated. Detective Inspector Crawford's investigation revealed disturbing details about Marcus Webb's planning. He had visited the palace on 3 previous occasions, studying the ceremony and the security arrangements. His notebook found in his apartment contained detailed observations about guard positions, crowd patterns, and what he perceived as vulnerabilities in the protection of tourists. The attack had not been a spontaneous act of mental illness, but a carefully planned assault that had been weeks in the making. The royal family issued a statement praising James's actions and announcing that he would receive a commendation for his service. The ceremony would be private, they explained, recognizing his preference for avoiding public attention. Queen Elizabeth herself had requested a personal meeting with the guard, who had upheld the highest traditions of duty while protecting an innocent child. Changes began to be implemented in security protocols based on lessons learned from the incident. Additional plainclothes officers were assigned to crowd areas during ceremonies, and communication systems were upgraded to allow faster coordination between ceremonial guards and active security personnel. The balance between maintaining tradition and ensuring public safety required constant refinement, and Marcus Webb's attack had highlighted areas where improvements were needed. James struggled with the label of hero that the media had attached to him. In his own mind, he had simply done what his training and conscience had demanded. The idea that his actions were somehow extraordinary troubled him, as it implied that choosing duty over protocol was unusual rather than expected. He worried that celebrating his decision might suggest that other guards would have acted differently, an implication he knew to be false. Emma Thompson returned to school with a story that made her the center of attention among her classmates. Her teacher, recognizing the educational value of the experience, arranged for James to visit the school and speak to the children about service, duty, and the importance of helping others. The visit was transformative for many of the students, who saw in James's quiet dignity a model of what heroism actually looked like. The psychological impact on witnesses varied dramatically. Some tourists reported feeling safer knowing that protection was so readily available, while others found their trust in public spaces permanently shaken. Several witnesses required counseling to process what they had seen, the sudden intrusion of violence into what should have been a peaceful vacation leaving lasting scars. Support groups formed organically among those who had been present during the attack. Social media allowed them to connect and share their experiences, creating a community bound by a shared moment of crisis. Many reported that witnessing James's response had restored their faith in humanity and in the dedication of those who serve in uniform. The knife used in the attack became a crucial piece of evidence in understanding Marcus Webb's mental state. Forensic analysis revealed that he had practiced with it repeatedly, the blade showing wear patterns consistent with extensive use. His apartment contained additional weapons and detailed plans for other potential attacks, evidence of a disturbed mind that had been contemplating violence for an extended period. James's family watched the media coverage with a mixture of pride and concern. His wife had always known that his military service could require him to face danger, but seeing her husband tackle an armed man in front of hundreds of cameras brought the reality of his chosen profession into sharp focus. Their children struggled to understand why Daddy was on television, though they were proud when classmates recognized their father as the hero guard. 6 months after the incident, life had found a new rhythm for everyone involved. James Mitchell had returned to his regular duties with the Queen's Guard, though his famous face meant that tourists now specifically sought him out for photos. He handled the attention with the same quiet professionalism that had defined his response to Marcus Webb's attack, understanding that his role had evolved beyond ceremonial duty to include being a symbol of service and protection. Emma Thompson celebrated her 9th birthday with a party that included a special video message from James, arranged by her parents as a surprise. The recording showed him in his full ceremonial uniform, speaking directly to the camera with the warm smile that had become familiar to millions around the world. He wished her a happy birthday and reminded her to always be kind to others, a message that would become one of her most treasured possessions. The changes implemented at royal sites had created a new standard for balancing public access with security concerns. The additional plainclothes officers had already intercepted 2 potential threats, situations that might have escalated without the enhanced vigilance that Marcus Webb's attack had inspired. The lessons learned from that June morning had created a legacy of improved safety that extended far beyond Buckingham Palace. Marcus Webb was showing signs of improvement under his new treatment regimen. The combination of medication and therapy was slowly helping him rebuild his connection to reality, though the process was gradual and sometimes marked by setbacks. His doctors remained cautiously optimistic that he might eventually be able to function in society again, though under continued supervision, the attack had been the product of illness rather than evil, a distinction that provided some comfort to those who had been affected by his actions. James received notification that he had been selected for promotion to staff sergeant, an advancement that his commanding officers insisted had nothing to do with the media attention and everything to do with his demonstrated leadership under pressure. The promotion ceremony was conducted with military precision, but without fanfare, exactly as James preferred. His new responsibilities would include training younger guards in the values that had guided his own actions during the crisis. The documentary film crew that had requested access to create a program about the incident was politely, but firmly, declined by James and his family. They had no interest in further publicity and believed that the story had already been told through news coverage and social media posts. James maintained that the most important outcome was Emma Thompson's safety, not his own recognition, and he saw no value in extending the public attention beyond what had already occurred. Detective Inspector Crawford submitted her final report on the investigation, concluding that the attack had been prevented by the exceptional vigilance and immediate response of Sergeant Mitchell, whose actions exemplified the highest standards of public service. The report became required reading for security personnel at royal sites, serving as both a case study in threat assessment and an example of decisive action under pressure. Emma Thompson's school project about heroes featured James prominently, but also included her parents, her teacher, and the doctors who helped people like Marcus Webb. Her understanding of heroism had matured beyond fairy tale rescues to encompass the daily acts of service performed by ordinary people. The project won first place in her grade level, but more importantly, it demonstrated how the incident had shaped her developing sense of what it means to help others. The annual ceremony marking the anniversary of the attack was a private affair, attended only by the Thompson family, James and his family, and Detective Inspector Crawford. They gathered at the palace gates not to relive the trauma, but to celebrate the bonds that had been formed through shared experience. Emma presented James with a drawing she had made especially for the occasion, showing him not as a superhero, but as a regular person doing something extraordinary. James's letters from around the world continued to arrive, though in smaller numbers than in the immediate aftermath of the incident. Many were from children who had seen the news coverage and wanted to become guards themselves. Others came from veterans sharing their own stories of moments when training and instinct had combined to make split-second decisions that changed lives. Each letter was answered personally, James viewing the correspondence as an extension of his duty to serve and inspire. The bearskin hat that had fallen during the tackle was retired from active service and placed in the regimental museum, along with a plaque describing the events of that June morning. New recruits were brought to see the exhibit as part of their training, learning that the uniform they wore represented more than ceremony and tradition. It embodied a commitment to protection that could require them to act decisively when innocent. Lives were at stake. Mental health awareness programs implemented in response to the incident had begun to show positive results. Early intervention systems were identifying people like Marcus Webb before their conditions deteriorated to dangerous levels. The attack had served as a wake-up call about the need for better support systems for those struggling with psychological crisis, creating positive change that extended far beyond security protocols. James often reflected on how a single moment had changed so many lives in ways both profound and subtle. The 3 seconds between recognizing the threat and neutralizing it had created ripple effects that continued to spread months later. Emma Thompson was growing up with an understanding of both danger and protection that would shape her worldview forever. Her parents had developed a deeper appreciation for the strangers who dedicate their lives to keeping others safe. The training programs for ceremonial guards now included specific scenarios based on the Webb incident, teaching new recruits how to balance protocol with immediate threat response. James had become an instructor in these programs, sharing his experience not as a hero's tale but as a practical lesson in decision-making under pressure. His students learned that wearing the uniform meant being ready to act when duty demanded it, regardless of the circumstances. Public perception of the Queen's Guard had evolved as well. Where tourists once saw the guards as colorful figures for photo opportunities, many now understood them as highly trained protectors whose ceremonial duties concealed their readiness for real action. James noticed the change in how people approached him during his shifts, with more genuine respect and fewer attempts to make him break character for entertainment. The friendship that had developed between the Thompson and Mitchell families was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of the entire experience. Regular letters between Emma and James had evolved into family visits and holiday gatherings. Emma's parents credited James not just with saving their daughter's life, but with providing a model of service and humility that had enriched their entire family's understanding of what it means to live with purpose. Marcus Webb's recovery continued slowly but steadily. His psychiatrist reported that he had begun to understand the severity of what he had almost done, expressing genuine remorse for the terror he had caused. The treatment team was cautiously optimistic about his eventual rehabilitation, though they emphasized that his case highlighted the critical importance of early intervention in mental health crises. The security improvements implemented after the attack had prevented several other potential incidents, proving that the lessons learned from that June morning had real and lasting value. James took quiet satisfaction in knowing that his split-second decision had not only saved one child, but had contributed to systemic changes that would protect countless others in the future. As he stood at his post during ceremonies, James continued to scan the crowds with the same vigilance that had served him so well. But now he also noticed the children who pointed at him with recognition, the parents who smiled with genuine gratitude, and the fellow service members who nodded with understanding, respect. The moment that had changed everything had become part of who he was, not as a burden or a source of pride, but simply as another day when duty had called and he had answered. The story of the man who pulled a knife on a child and the Royal Guard's silent response continued to resonate, because it represented something fundamental about human nature at its best. In a world often filled with negativity and division, it served as a reminder that there are people who stand ready to protect strangers, who choose service over self-interest, and who understand that true heroism lies not in seeking glory, but in simply doing what is right when the moment demands it. Years would pass and Emma Thompson would grow up to become a teacher herself, inspired by the example of service she had witnessed that day. James Mitchell would eventually retire from the Queen's Guard with honors, his legacy defined not by any single moment of action but by a lifetime of quiet dedication to duty. And somewhere in a treatment facility, Marcus Webb would continue his journey toward healing, a reminder that behind every act of violence is a human being in need of help and compassion. The knife that had threatened so much harm was eventually destroyed, its metal recycled into something useful and peaceful. But the memory of what it represented, and more importantly, the memory of how it was stopped, would live on as testament to the power of courage.